At dawn on a quiet morning in March 1944, a lone figure stood on the wind-swept bridge of a carrier anchored off Sumatra. Vice Admiral Jizaburō Ozawa watched the pale light rise through the haze, knowing the ship beneath him was more than steel. It was hope welded into a single hull, hammered together from dwindling resources and entrusted with the future of Japan's Pacific War aircraft carriers. Taihō had taken nearly 3 years to build. 3 years of labor, sacrifice, and faith. Across the ocean, America had built 17 carriers in that same span. Not escort ships, not converted hulls. 17 fleet carriers, and the United States was still accelerating. For Ozawa, the numbers did not feel like statistics. They felt like a verdict. How had a nation that entered the war with so few Pacific War aircraft carriers unleashed an armada of Essex-class carriers at a pace no admiral could comprehend? What force could bend time, steel, and manpower to such a scale? The answer lay far from any battlefield. It hid in factories, lit through the night in shipyards, crowded with untrained hands, learning impossible skills, in an overwhelming World War II industrial capacity that reshaped the Pacific before a single sortie was launched. And it began long before Taihō touched the water. Long before the great carrier battles defined the Pacific, Japan believed it had already mastered the future of naval warfare. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had studied, refined, and perfected the art of carrier operations. It entered the war with 6 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers, modern, fast, and battle-tested. Its aviators were elite professionals, shaped by years of combat over China. Its doctrine was not theoretical. It had been carved from experience, discipline, and blood. In 1941, no nation on Earth possessed a more formidable force of Pacific War aircraft carriers. Across the ocean, the United States appeared unprepared. Its carrier doctrine was still evolving. Its pilots were inexperienced. Its fleet was smaller and scattered. On paper, Japan should have dominated the Pacific for years. Yet hidden beneath these surface comparisons was a deeper truth, one that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood long before the first bomb fell at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had walked through American factories. He had toured shipyards, stretched across miles of coastline, watched production lines turning out engines, machine tools, and steel in quantities Japan could never match. He knew that carrier warfare was not simply about courage or tactical brilliance. It was about World War II industrial capacity, the ability to replace every plane, every pilot, every ship lost. Japan could win battles, he warned, but only for 6 months. After that, America's industrial tide would rise too high to resist. The early months of the war seemed to challenge that prediction. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese pilots sank the light carrier USS Lexington and destroyed the smaller USS Sims and USS Neosho. They also lost the light carrier Shoho, but the damage felt manageable, even acceptable. Japan still held the initiative. Its Pacific War aircraft carriers were operating with precision, its aircrews flying at a level unmatched by any Allied force. But the illusion of security cracked at Midway. In June 1942, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu, were destroyed in the span of a single morning. Years of expertise, thousands of trained crew members, hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft vanished in minutes. The disaster was more than a tactical loss. It was a fracture in Japan's strategic foundation. When planners in Tokyo assessed the damage, the mathematics were brutal. Replacing those 4 carriers would require the nation's major shipyards, Yokosuka Kure and Kobe, to halt nearly all other production destroyers, cruisers, submarines, merchant ships. Every resource would need to flow into rebuilding the Pacific War aircraft carriers that had been lost. Even under ideal conditions, the timeline stretched into years. Japan did not have years, and as the Imperial Navy confronted its limits, American mobilization was only beginning. The United States was not simply preparing for war, it was reorganizing its society around it. Factories expanded, shipyards multiplied, new workers, many without any maritime background, began flooding into production lines. In the distance, the first outlines of the Essex-class carriers were taking shape, each one a monument to a nation's industrial will. The war in the Pacific had been set into motion by torpedoes and aircraft. But its true beginning, the silent shift that would decide its course, was the moment one nation looked at its losses and saw the edge of its capabilities, while the other looked at its potential and saw no limit at all. The shock of Midway sent ripples through Tokyo's naval headquarters, but the Imperial Japanese Navy still hoped it could recover. Taihō was already under construction, and the new Unryū-class carriers were designed as faster, more practical replacements. Planners believed these ships could help rebuild the striking power of Japan's Pacific War aircraft carriers. Yet every optimistic blueprint hid a harsher reality. The nation was already falling behind the accelerating machine of American production. While Japan struggled to concentrate scarce resources into a handful of hulls, the United States was transforming its shipyards into engines of multiplication. No figure embodied this revolution more than Henry Kaiser. He had never built a ship before the war, but he understood mass production better than any naval engineer. To Kaiser, a vessel was not a handcrafted masterpiece. It was a modular structure, something that could be broken into parts, prefabricated in separate facilities, and welded together with astonishing speed. His Liberty ships proved the concept. His escort carriers made it undeniable. And in the background, other shipyards, especially Newport News, were preparing to apply the same philosophy to something far more complex, the fleet carriers that would become the backbone of American sea power. This was the birth of the Essex-class carriers, a series built not as individual masterpieces, but as standardized warships. Each component, flight decks, elevators, propulsion modules, radar masts, was fabricated in specialized shops, tested, and then lowered into place with towering cranes. Welding replaced riveting. Assembly replaced crafting. Repetition replaced artistry. Within months, the United States had mastered a process that compressed years of carrier construction into little more than a single campaign season. By late 1943, American shipyards were launching Essex-class carriers in squadron strength. What seemed impossible at the war's beginning, multiple fleet carriers rolling off assembly lines in parallel, had become routine. And this transformation of World War II industrial capacity reshaped every battle that followed. Japan still had skilled pilots, but their replacements were rushed through shortened training programs. Japan still had carriers, but many could not be fully equipped with aircraft. Japan still had courage, but courage was not a renewable resource. Every loss cut deeper, every pilot killed, represented months of training. Japan no longer had fuel to provide. Then came the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when hundreds of Japanese aircraft lifted off to strike the American fleet. They were flying into a new kind of war, one shaped by radar interception, coordinated fighter direction, and the overwhelming presence of nearly 1,000 aircraft launched from the Pacific War aircraft carriers of Task Force 58. Hellcats soared upward in layers, guided by radar systems that Japan could not duplicate. Anti-aircraft fire erupted upward with proximity-fused shells. Within minutes, entire Japanese strike waves dissolved in the sky. What unfolded that day was more than a battle. It was the collision of two realities. One navy built on decades of skill, and another propelled by an industrial surge that simply could not be matched. When the smoke cleared, Japan had lost the heart of its air arm, while America's Essex-class carriers had only begun to show their full power. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did more than shatter Japan's air arm. It exposed the full weight of a nation running out of time, steel fuel, and men. And in the hours that followed, the initial strikes, the consequences grew painfully clear. Taihō, the pride of Japan's Pacific War aircraft carriers, took a single torpedo hit. It was the kind of wound most navies could control. But Japan's damage control systems were thin, its training inconsistent, and its ventilation design risky. When gasoline vapor spread through the ship's compartments, one spark turned Taihō into an inferno. 3 months of service, 32 months of construction, over 1,000 men lost in minutes. Shokaku and Hiyo followed her into the deep that same day. Each sinking tore away more than a hull. It erased pilots, flight crews, mechanics, people whose expertise Japan could no longer replace. The Imperial Navy still had other carriers, but many were empty or half-filled, short of aircraft and airmen alike. The war was beginning to consume its foundation faster than Japan could rebuild it. Meanwhile, the United States moved with unstoppable momentum. The Essex-class carriers were entering the Pacific in waves, sleek, powerful, standardized ships, backed by a nation whose World War II industrial capacity seemed limitless. When an Essex carrier was damaged, it limped to Pearl Harbor or San Francisco, where prefabricated sections were ready to slot into place like pieces of a vast mechanical puzzle. Repairs that would have taken Japan months could be completed by American shipyards in weeks. Japan had no such reserve. Fuel shortages shut down training flights. Machine tools broke and could not be replaced. Railroads strained to move the steel that remained. Submarine attacks crippled coastal shipping, severing critical supply lines. Even new carriers suffered. Some Unryū-class ships were completed with destroyer engines because Japan could not produce carrier turbines fast enough. Their slower speed made them vulnerable. Their role diminished before they ever sailed into battle. And yet Japan fought on. By October 1944, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's remaining carriers were nearly empty, used not as strike platforms, but as decoys. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, sailed into her final battle with a handful of aircraft aboard. When she went down under American bombs and torpedoes, an era ended with her. Japan's force of Pacific War aircraft carriers, once the most advanced in the world, had been reduced to symbols courageous but hollow. The cost was staggering. Thousands of sailors lost, hundreds of pilots gone, years of craftsmanship, training, and sacrifice erased in a series of battles Japan could not afford to fight. Each loss hardened a reality that had been growing since the war began. The Imperial Navy was not losing to better tactics or braver men, but to a system of production that outpaced every effort to resist it. When the last carrier slipped beneath the waves, Japan was left with ships. It could not fuel airfields. It could not defend. And a homeland exposed to the reach of America's Essex-class carriers, whose presence grew with every month. The imbalance was no longer measured in ships alone, but in the overwhelming machinery of industrial war. A tide. Japan was never equipped to turn back. As Japan's naval air arm faded from the Pacific, American strategy entered a new phase, one defined not by desperate improvisation, but by an overwhelming confidence built on industrial strength. The United States no longer sailed cautiously, counting every carrier as a precious asset. Instead, it deployed task forces that seemed almost impossible in scale. Task Force 28, operating off Japan in 1945, embodied this shift. 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, together launching more than 1,500 aircraft. It was a floating continent of firepower, a manifestation of World War II industrial capacity that no nation had ever seen. To American commanders, the lesson was unmistakable. Naval aviation was no longer limited by the fragile balance of pilot skill or individual ship performance. It was now a system: radar networks, fighter direction centers, repair ships, logistics vessels, and the standardized might of the Essex-class carriers, working in unison. Every element reinforced the next. When one carrier took damage, another filled the gap. When a ship returned for repairs, a prefabricated section was already waiting. When new pilots rotated into combat groups, they stepped into a doctrine built on layers of coordination and technological advantage. Other nations watched closely. For observers in Europe and Asia, the rise of the Pacific War aircraft carriers demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern conflict wars could no longer be won by heroics alone. They required depth, industrial depth, logistical depth, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. America's wartime mobilization became a case study for future generations. From Cold War strategists to modern military planners, seeking to understand how nations project power across oceans. Even within the United States, this transformation reshaped how the country viewed itself. Factories in the Midwest shipyards, on the coasts, and assembly lines filled with workers who had never seen the sea became part of a national narrative, one in which ordinary people bound together by effort and purpose could tilt the balance of a global war. The Essex-class carriers were symbols, yes, but they were also the direct result of a society that believed victory depended on every hand, every shift, every ton of steel laid down. By 1945, the message was unmistakable. Industrial power was not just an advantage, it was the decisive factor. And the world understood that any nation aspiring to project force across the oceans would need more than courage. It would need the kind of World War II industrial capacity that had filled the Pacific with American carriers and rendered Japan's once elite fleet unable to fight back. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific Ocean looked nothing like it had 4 years earlier. Japan had entered the war with the most experienced carrier force on Earth. Disciplined aviators, refined tactics, and a fleet of Pacific War aircraft carriers that symbolized 2 decades of naval innovation. Yet by the end, not a single operational Japanese fleet carrier remained afloat. The nation that once led the world in carrier warfare had been overtaken by a power whose strength did not lie in tradition or early war skill, but in an industrial engine that reshaped the very nature of conflict. Across the ocean, America stood with a navy that had grown beyond strategic necessity. 17 completed Essex-class carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and more than 100 escort carriers had been commissioned during the war. Some arrived too late to see combat. Others replaced ships damaged on the front line before their paint had even dried. The scale was staggering, a direct reflection of the nation's World War II industrial capacity, an ability to mass-produce warships with a speed once reserved for automobiles and consumer goods. But the true legacy of this industrial triumph was not measured in steel alone. It lived in the people who made it possible: the welders in Richmond, the machinists in Detroit, the ship fitters in Newport, newsmen and women who had never stepped onto a carrier deck, yet built the platforms from which thousands of American aviators fought. Their work ensured that when one carrier fell, another stood ready. When a deck buckled under enemy fire, a replacement section was waiting in a warehouse. When pilots launched into the sky, they did so from ships born of a national effort unlike anything in history. For Japan, the story was different, marked by sacrifice, courage, and the slow realization that no amount of bravery could overcome a deficit in industrial strength. The loss of each carrier was a national tragedy. The loss of trained air crews was a wound that could not be healed. The Pacific War proved that in the modern era, valor could shape battles, but only industry could shape wars. And so the final lesson endures. The fate of the Pacific was not sealed by a single battle, nor by a single admiral's decision. It was determined in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines long before Taihō sailed, long before Midway, long before the last desperate sorties over the Philippine Sea. The story of the Pacific War aircraft carriers is ultimately the story of industrial power, of what a nation can achieve when its entire society commits to a single purpose. That is the legacy of the Essex-class carriers, and the overwhelming World War II industrial capacity behind them. It is a legacy that continues to shape military strategy, national planning, and our understanding of how wars are truly won.